He came to collect an inheritance. He never expected to find her still there. She was behind his dead brother's desk ledger, open lamp burning low, like she'd been holding the whole place together by sheer will alone. She looked up when he walked in and didn't flinch, didn't apologize, didn't move. "You're too late to save him," she said quietly. "But you're not too late to save what he built." Ethan Calloway hadn't spoken to a woman like that in a long time. One who looked at a broken thing and stayed anyway. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Neither of them knew it was the beginning of everything. If this story already has you gripped, subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The Telegraph had found Ethan in the middle of branding season. He'd been working a calf at the south fence of his leased quarter section outside Miles City when his foreman rode out with the yellow paper folded in his hatband. Ethan read it once, then he read it again. Then he handed it back without a word, walked to the water trough, and stood there with his hands in the cold water for a long time. Daniel Calloway deceased. Fever. 3 days gone. His older brother. The one who'd gone north and built something. The one who'd always known how to turn nothing into something. The one who had sent Ethan a Christmas letter every year without fail, always ending the same way. "Come north when you're ready, little brother. There's room here for 2 Callaways." Ethan had never gone. He'd always thought there was more time. Now there wasn't. He rode into Blackstone Ridge on a Thursday morning, trail-worn and hollow-eyed, with a single saddlebag and a folded letter from Daniel's attorney that named him sole heir to the Calloway Ranch holdings, 1,400 acres, a main house, 2 bunkhouses, a cattle operation, and whatever financial accounts remained in Daniel's name. The town was quieter than he'd expected for a settlement that size. A general store, a livery, a land office, 2 saloons, a church with a sagging steeple. People looked at him the way people always looked at a stranger passing through, long enough to note him, quick enough to look away. He found the ranch attorney's office above the hardware store. A small man named Pruitt, with ink-stained fingers and nervous hands, shook Ethan's hand and sat him down and began talking very fast about the estate. "Substantial holdings," Pruitt said, shuffling papers. 1,400 acres, as the letter states. The main house is in good repair. The cattle operation is—" He paused, cleared his throat. "There are some financial matters requiring attention." "What kind of matters?" "Debts, contractual obligations, several outstanding agreements with suppliers, and how much debt?" Pruitt looked at the papers instead of at Ethan. "That figure is still being determined." "Give me a number." Pruitt named a number. Ethan sat very still. It was not a small number. It was the kind of number that made 1,400 acres feel considerably smaller. "That doesn't include the disputed contracts," Pruitt added, as though that might help. "What disputed contracts?" "There are several land use agreements your brother entered into in the last 2 years. Some of them contain language that is open to interpretation." He finally looked up. "Mr. Calloway, your brother was a man of ambition. Sometimes ambition runs ahead of caution." Ethan stood up. "I want to see the ranch." He rode out alone. The land was everything Daniel's letters had described, wide and rolling. The grass still carrying the last of summer's green, the mountains visible in the northwest, like a painted edge on the world. The cattle he passed looked healthy enough. The fences were in reasonable repair. From the saddle, it looked like a working ranch. But Ethan had worked ranches his whole life. He knew the difference between what a place looked like and what it was. The main house was a solid 2-story structure with a broad porch and curtains in the windows. Someone had kept it. There was fresh split wood stacked against the side wall. The kitchen garden had been recently watered. He tied his horse at the post and pushed open the front door. The smell of coffee hit him first. Then voices from the back of the house. One of them a woman speaking in a tone of careful, controlled authority. "The Granger account hasn't been reconciled in 4 months. If we don't correct that before the creditors send someone, they'll use the discrepancy as grounds to accelerate the note." A man's voice uncertain. "Yes, ma'am?" "And the feed supplier in Helena. I need that amended invoice before Friday." The original was inflated by nearly $40, and I have the comparison receipts to prove it. I'll ride to Helena tomorrow if you need. I need it before Friday. Decide accordingly." Ethan followed the voices to what had been Daniel's study. The room was in organized chaos, stacks of ledger books, loose papers arranged in careful columns, a filing crate that looked newly sorted. A young ranch hand stood near the door, looking grateful to have a reason to leave. And behind the desk, Daniel's desk, sat a woman. She was perhaps 30, with dark hair pinned up under the kind of practical efficiency that suggested she'd stopped thinking about appearances some time ago. Her clothes were clean, but working clothes. Her hands, folded on the open ledger in front of her, were not soft hands. She wore no jewelry. She had the bearing of someone who had been in charge of this room for long enough that she'd forgotten it wasn't hers. She looked at Ethan without surprise. That was the first thing he noticed. No surprise. "You're the brother," she said. "Ethan Calloway." "I know who you are." She didn't stand. "I'm Eliza Hartley. I was your brother's bookkeeper." "Was." "Still am in practice. Someone had to keep this from collapsing after he died." She gestured at the chair across the desk. His brother's chair, he realized, turned to face her. "Sit down, Mr. Calloway. We have a great deal to discuss." He didn't sit. "I just came from the attorney. Pruitt." Something moved across her face. "What did he tell you?" "Debts, disputed contracts. He was light on details." "He's always light on details when the details are inconvenient." She closed the ledger in front of her and opened a different one, older, its pages tabbed with small paper markers. "Then I'll give you the details." "I didn't ask for—" "Mr. Calloway." Her voice was even. Not sharp, not deferential. Just direct, the way a level line is direct, no rise, no fall. "Your brother's estate has debts totaling nearly $11,000. Approximately $4,000 of that is legitimate operational costs, a banknote on the North Pasture Expansion Fair supplier accounts. The remaining $7,000 is not." Ethan looked at her for a moment. "Not what?" "Not legitimate." She opened the ledger to a marked page and turned it so he could see. "These supplier invoices see the dates." The amounts were adjusted after the fact. Someone changed the figures. "I have the original delivery receipts, and they don't match what was submitted to the account books." He stepped closer, looked at the columns of figures she was pointing to. He wasn't a bookkeeper, but he could read numbers. "Who changed them?" "I don't know yet, but I know when it started about 18 months ago. Before that, the accounts are clean." "And the contracts Pruitt mentioned." She was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that meant she was deciding something. "The contracts are more complicated," she said. "I'd rather walk you through them one at a time. Some of them have legal language that needs to be read carefully." "Why haven't you taken this to the attorney?" "Because I'm not certain Pruitt isn't part of it." The room went very still. Ethan pulled the chair out and sat down. She talked for nearly 2 hours. She was precise. She never overstated, and she never understated. She showed him the original records alongside the altered ones, the delivery receipts that didn't match the invoices, the supply contracts that contained clauses Daniel almost certainly hadn't understood when he signed them. She showed him 3 land use agreements that contained language allowing the other party to acquire portions of Calloway land under conditions that were, in her word, engineered to be triggered. "Your brother trusted people he shouldn't have trusted," she said near the end of it. "That's not a character flaw. He was generous and he believed in good faith. Those aren't bad qualities, but they made him easy to deceive. And you knew all this while he was alive." She met his eyes. "I knew something was wrong. I didn't know the full shape of it until I started pulling the records apart after he died. Some of it was hidden. Some of it I think your brother didn't want to look too closely." "Why?" She didn't answer that immediately. She turned the ledger around and closed it and set her hands flat on the cover. "Because I think he knew he was in over his head, and he was hoping to work his way out before anyone found out how deep in he was." Her voice was quieter now, not softer. The volume dropped, but the steadiness didn't. "He was a proud man, your brother." Ethan looked at the window. Outside, a ranch hand was crossing toward the barn. The sky was going orange at the edges. "You stayed after he died," he said. "Someone had to." "You didn't have to. You weren't obligated." "No," she agreed. "I wasn't." "So why?" She was quiet for a moment, not evasive thinking. Because the men who put Daniel in this position were counting on the estate being in chaos after his death. Chaos makes it easier to press legal claims, easier to invoke those contract clauses, easier to walk away with land that isn't theirs. She looked at him. "I wasn't willing to let that happen." "You don't even know me." "No, but I knew your brother. And I know what this ranch cost him." She stood finally and picked up the ledger. "What I don't know, Mr. Calloway, is whether you can be trusted with what I've found." He stared at her. "Excuse me. Your brother was a man who could be deceived. I don't know if you're different." She said it without cruelty, with the same flat directness she'd used for everything else. "I've spent 3 months putting this evidence together. I'm not going to hand it to someone who'll use it wrong or panic and make the situation worse." The anger moved through him quick and clean, like cold water. He let it pass. "What do you need to know?" he asked. She studied him for a long moment. "Not yet," she said. "I need to see how you handle the next few days first." The next morning, she was already at the desk when he came downstairs. She'd been there before dawn. He could tell the coffee was long since made, and the lamps had been lit and extinguished again as the daylight came up. She had 3 ledgers open and a 4th stacked to her left, with a ribbon marker in it. He poured coffee and stood in the doorway. "The feed supplier is overcharging by roughly 15%, she said without looking up. "The lumber account has a false charge from 8 months ago that was never corrected, and I found a promissory note in the bottom of that filing cabinet." She nodded toward the cabinet in the corner that Pruitt never mentioned. Ethan walked to the cabinet, opened it, found the promissory note where she'd flagged it with a paper marker, read it. It was a note for $2,000 made out in Daniel's name secured against the south pasture. "He didn't mention this," Ethan said. "No?" Eliza said. "He didn't. Does he know about it? He handled the estate filing. He would have found it if he'd looked." Ethan set the note down very carefully. "Who holds this note?" "A land investment company out of Billings. They call themselves the Western Territorial Development Group." She finally looked up. "I've been trying to find out who owns that company for 2 months. It's structured to obscure the principals. Why would a land investment company be holding a personal note secured against a single pasture? Because," she said, "the pasture is the access corridor to the North 40. Without it, the North 40 is landlocked." She paused. "If the note defaults, they don't get the pasture, but they get the right to negotiate. And their contracts are written to make negotiation go one direction." He looked at her across the room. "Someone planned this," he said. "Someone planned this," she agreed. "Over at least 2 years, possibly longer." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, he could hear the ranch beginning its morning horses. Men's voices, the distant sound of the cattle. "Eliza," he said. It was the first time he'd used her name. She didn't react to it, but she waited. "What exactly do you think happened to my brother?" She set her pen down. "I think Daniel found out what was happening to him," she said. "Not all of it, but enough. I think he was trying to find a way to fight it that didn't involve admitting how badly he'd been deceived." She folded her hands. "I think the stress of that on top of everything else wore him down, and I think the fever found him when he had nothing left to fight it with." Ethan didn't say anything for a long time. "He didn't die of being stupid," Ethan said finally. His voice was rough. "No," Eliza said quietly. "He died of being honest in a situation that had no room for honesty." She picked up her pen. "That's different." The first supplier confrontation happened that afternoon. A man named Greer arrived from the General Mercantile in town to collect on what he said was a 60-day outstanding account. Ethan met him on the porch. The amount Greer named was $40 more than the delivery records showed. Ethan had looked at enough of Eliza's ledgers by then to know the difference. That figure's wrong, Ethan said. Greer blinked. I beg your pardon. The delivery records from April show $32 and change. You're telling me 68. I want to see your original invoice. Greer's expression shifted not much, but enough. He'd been expecting the new heir to be distracted, overwhelmed, easy to push. The prices have adjusted since. Bring me the invoice. Ethan's voice was quiet, but it carried. The original one dated at delivery. I'll wait. Greer looked past him. Eliza was standing in the doorway behind Ethan with a ledger under her arm and an expression of perfect neutrality on her face. Greer left without the money. When the sound of his horse had faded down the road, Ethan turned to find Eliza watching him. That's the third time this month someone's tried that, she said. Did they succeed before? The ranch foreman paid 2 of them before I caught it. He wasn't involved, he just didn't know to look. She pushed herself off the doorframe. He knows now. Is he trustworthy? The foreman? Walt Briggs. Yes, he's been here 12 years. Daniel trusted him and so do I. She paused. He doesn't understand the financial side of things, but he knows cattle, and he knows land, and he will not be bought. Good, Ethan said. I need someone I can count on while I'm learning this place. She looked at him then, not with approval exactly, but with the particular attention of someone revising an assessment. You're going to stay, she said. Of course I'm going to stay. A lot of men in your position would have sold, cut their losses. Sold to who? He knew the answer before she said it. The Western Territorial Development Group, she said, has already sent 1 letter asking if the estate would consider offers. When? A week after Daniel died. He let that land, let the shape of it settle. They were ready, he said. They were ready, she confirmed. He went back inside. She followed, set the ledger on the desk, and opened it to a fresh page. We have a lot of work to do, she said. Yes, he agreed. We do. He pulled the second chair around to her side of the desk and sat. She looked at the arrangement for a moment. Then she moved the ledger slightly so he could see it better. Start with the feed accounts, she said. Tell me what you see. He leaned forward and looked. Outside, the wind moved across the Montana grass the way it always had, patient, indifferent, waiting for whoever was strong enough to hold what the land offered. Ethan Calloway looked at the numbers in front of him and began to learn what his brother had left him. It was not a fortune, not yet, but it was a fight, and for the first time since the telegraph found him in a branding pen outside Miles City, that felt like something he understood. The feed accounts took 3 hours. By the end of it, Ethan's jaw was tight, and his coffee had gone cold twice, and he'd refilled it without tasting it either time. The numbers told a story that made him angrier the clearer it became, not the loud breaking kind of angry, but the slow grinding kind that settles into a man's chest and stays there. $43 overcharged on spring feed, $27 on winter hay. A lumber delivery from 7 months ago that had been billed twice under different invoice numbers. A water rights maintenance fee that had no corresponding service record anywhere in the files. Who was reconciling these accounts before you? He asked. Eliza didn't look up from the column she was cross-referencing. A man named Fowler. Daniel hired him about 2 years ago to handle the daily bookkeeping. Said he came recommended from a business contact in Billings. Ethan set down his pen. Billings. Yes. Same city as the Western Territorial Development Group. She looked up then. I noticed that too. Where's Fowler now? He left the week Daniel died. Said he had family obligations. Her voice carried exactly nothing when she said it. No accusation, no drama. Just the fact laid flat. He was gone before I could ask him anything. Ethan pushed back from the desk and stood. He walked to the window and stood with his arms crossed, looking at nothing. How long did it take you to find all of this? He asked. The obvious errors, 2 weeks. The deeper manipulation, the invoice substitutions, the contract language that took longer. I'm still finding things. You've been doing this alone. There wasn't anyone else. He turned around. You could have walked away. The second Daniel died, your employment ended. You had no obligation to any of this. She set her pen down with a small, precise click. Mr. Calloway, the men who did this were counting on no one looking. Every day I stayed and kept working was a day they didn't get to finish what they started. She met his eyes steadily. I wasn't going to give them that, even without knowing if anyone was coming to help you. I didn't need help. I needed time. He looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze without effort, without challenge, just with the quiet certainty of someone who had already decided what she was and didn't need anyone else to confirm it. He sat back down. Show me the contract language. The contracts were worse than the invoices. The invoices were theft, straightforward criminal, the kind of thing that could be corrected with evidence and a judge willing to listen. But the contracts were something more sophisticated. They were written to look reasonable on the surface, full of standard frontier land use terminology that any rancher would recognize. But buried in the middle sections in language that ran together and referred back to earlier clauses in ways that required careful reading to untangle, were provisions that had no business being there. One contract, a grazing rights agreement on the eastern boundary, contained a clause allowing the other party to purchase that boundary section at a fixed price if Calloway Ranch defaulted on any financial obligation within a 5-year window. The fixed price was a fraction of the land's actual value, and the definition of financial obligation had been written broadly enough to include the disputed invoices. They built the default mechanism themselves, Ethan said. He said it quietly, the way a man speaks when the ground shifts under him. They inflated the invoices to create a debt, then wrote contracts that let them collect land when the debt went unpaid. That's what I believe, yes. Can you prove it? I can prove the invoices were altered. I can prove the timeline the contracts were signed after the invoice manipulation began, which means whoever drafted them knew the financial situation they were creating. She paused. Proving that the same people did both is harder. The contracts were handled through a third party, a land attorney out of Helena named Durst. Is Durst connected to the development group? I haven't been able to establish that directly. But he drafted 3 of the 5 problematic contracts, and his fee was paid by a holding account I can't trace. She folded her hands on the desk. Someone was paying him, and it wasn't Daniel. Ethan stood up again. He needed to move. The study was too small for what he was feeling. Who in this town knew what was happening? He asked from across the room. I don't know. That's the honest answer. She turned in her chair to face him. I've been careful about who I talked to. Until I knew whether Pruitt was involved, I couldn't take anything to legal authorities. And there's a land commissioner who comes through Blackstone Ridge twice a year, whose relationship with some of these supply operators feels comfortable in ways I don't like. Comfortable. They drink together. They laugh easily. Men who've been taking money from the same pot laugh a certain way. She said it without bitterness, just observation. I've learned to recognize it. He looked at her. How long have you been doing this kind of work? Accounting? Accounting in situations like this one. A beat of silence. Something shifted in her expression. Not much, just a small recalibration, the way a person's face changes when a question gets closer to something real. My father was a merchant, she said. He was a good man and a poor businessman, and he trusted the wrong people twice before I was old enough to help him, and once after. She picked up her pen, looked at it, set it back down. By the time I was 17, I could read a ledger the way other women read letters. I knew what honest numbers looked like, and I knew what manipulated ones looked like. The difference isn't as subtle as people think once you know what to look for. Your father lost everything the third time. Flat. Final. He didn't survive it. She picked up the pen again, and this time she used it. So, I know what it looks like when someone is being systematically robbed through paperwork, and I know what it costs when no one catches it in time. Ethan was quiet. He didn't say he was sorry. He had a feeling she'd received enough of that particular currency and found it spent quickly. Then we catch it, he said. She didn't look up, but something in the set of her shoulders changed barely, almost nothing. "Yes," she said. "We do." Boink. Walt Briggs came in just before noon. He was a big man, weathered in the way of men who'd spent 30 years outdoors, with a gray mustache and hands that looked like they'd been carved from saddle leather. He'd been running the ranch's daily operations since Daniel's death, and he moved through the house with the careful respect of someone who knew he was on borrowed authority. He nodded at Ethan. "Mr. Calloway." "Walt, sit down." Briggs sat. He glanced at Eliza, then back at Ethan. "She told you the full picture?" he asked, nodding toward Eliza. "She's been telling me." "Good." He exhaled. "I should have pushed harder when Fowler was here. Something about that man never sat right with me. The way he'd stop talking when I walked in. The way he and that Durst fellow used to sit on the porch when he came out from Helena." He shook his head. "I didn't know enough about the books to know what to look for. I wish I had." "You couldn't have known," Eliza said. "Fowler was careful." "What do you need from me now?" Briggs asked, directing the question to Ethan. "I need to know the ranch's real operational condition. Not the paper condition, the actual one. Cattle water fence lines equipment. What's genuine and what's been let go." Briggs nodded slowly. "The cattle are good. 90 head in better shape than the books show. I think Fowler was underreporting the herd count, probably to suppress the asset valuation. The north fence needs work, but it's not urgent. The well on the east side was running slow last month, but it's come back." He paused. "The thing I'd worry about is the hay supply going into winter. We're short on what was ordered, and with the way the suppliers have been—" "I'll handle the suppliers," Eliza said. She was already writing. "I have the corrected invoices ready for 3 of them. Once they understand the estate is being actively managed, the overcharging will stop." "Or escalate," Ethan said. She looked at him. "Yes, or escalate. If it escalates, they're worried. If they're worried, they'll push the land claim sooner." Briggs looked between them. "You two work fast." "We don't have the luxury of slow," Ethan said. The first threat came that afternoon. Not from a supplier. From a man named Calder, who rode in just after 3 o'clock and said he represented interests that had an existing agreement with the Calloway estate and wanted to discuss the terms going forward. Calder was polished in a way that felt deliberate. Good coat, clean boots, the kind of haircut that cost money. He had a pleasant face and cold eyes, and the practiced manner of a man who delivered unpleasant things with a friendly tone and expected that to make them easier to swallow. Ethan met him on the porch. "I appreciate you coming out," Calder said, extending his hand. "I know this is a difficult time for the family." Ethan shook it, said nothing. "My clients have a land use agreement. I believe your attorney has the documentation that covers the eastern boundary section. Given the change in estate management, they wanted to touch base and make sure the transition is smooth." He smiled. "No one wants any unpleasantness." "What agreement specifically?" "The grazing rights contract from February of last year. Daniel was very cooperative in working that out. We'd like to continue in that same spirit." "That contract is under review," Ethan said. The pleasant expression didn't waver. "Under review, I see. May I ask by whom?" "By me." "Of course. And your legal counsel?" "When I need legal counsel, I'll retain it." A small pause. The smile stayed, but the quality of it changed the way light changes when a cloud moves over it. "Mr. Calloway, your brother entered into that agreement in good faith. My clients honored their obligations under it. They would hate to see a change in management complicate what's been a very productive arrangement. Then they'll give me time to review the documentation without pressure." "Naturally, no pressure intended." He reached into his coat and produced a card. "Please have your people contact mine when you're ready to discuss." He looked past Ethan toward the door. Eliza was standing just inside, visible through the screen. His gaze moved to her for a fraction of a second. "Good afternoon, Miss Hartley." "Mr. Calder," she said. He rode out without hurrying. Ethan waited until he was past the gate. "You know him. He came twice while Daniel was sick, supposedly to discuss the contract." She came out onto the porch. "The second time Daniel asked me to stay in the room during the meeting. I think by then he was starting to understand what the contract meant. What happened? Calder was very smooth. He suggested that if Daniel found the terms inconvenient, there were buyout options. Very generous ones, he said. She watched the road where Calder's dust was settling. He named a figure that sounded large, until you realized it was less than half the value of the eastern boundary acreage. Daniel didn't take it. No. He showed Calder out, and then he sat very quietly for a long time. She was quiet for a moment herself. 2 weeks later, he was dead. Ethan felt something cold move through him. You think? I think he died of fever. She said it firmly. I'm not suggesting otherwise, but I think the weight of what he was carrying didn't help him fight it. She turned and went back inside. Calder being here today means they already know you're not going to roll over easily. That card he gave you is a threat dressed as a courtesy. I know what it is. Good. Then don't use it. She was already back at the desk. Don't contact them on their terms on their timeline through their people. Every communication we have with them goes through documentation we control. He came back inside. You've thought about this. I've thought about very little else for 3 months. She opened the ledger. Now, the promissory note on the south pasture has a payment due in 60 days. We need to talk about that. They worked through supper. Briggs brought food in from the cookhouse and set it on the corner of the desk, and neither of them fully stopped working to eat it. The lamp burned low, and Ethan trimmed it without being asked, and they kept going. At some point, Ethan became aware that the rhythm of it, her voice, reading figures, his pen marking corrections, the back and forth of question and clarification had settled into something almost natural. Like they'd been doing it for months instead of hours. She caught something in the water rights file that he'd read past twice. He caught a billing error in the lumber account that she'd flagged, but not yet corrected. When they disagreed about the interpretation of a contract clause, and they did disagree directly and without apology on either side, they argued it through until one of them found the language that settled it. She was right, more often than he was. He noticed that she noticed that he noticed, and didn't make anything of it. That impressed him more than if she'd been gracious about it. Around 9 o'clock, she set her pen down and rubbed the bridge of her nose. The Harmon supply contract, she said. The one with the 30-day renewal clause. I read it. The renewal clause resets the pricing terms to whatever the supplier sets without cap. Daniel signed it 2 years ago. I think he didn't understand what the reset clause meant in practice. How much could they claim under it? Theoretically enough to create a significant shortfall that could trigger the default provisions in the boundary contract. She looked at him. Calder's clients may have suggested that contract language to Harmon. I can't prove it yet, but the timing is consistent. Ethan looked at the wall for a moment. Then, can the renewal be challenged? If we can show Daniel didn't have full information when he signed it, that the clause was not explained or was deliberately obscured possibly. It's a harder argument than the invoice fraud, but it's not impossible. She paused. I'd need a sympathetic judge, and I'd need to know who's on whose side before we file anything. Then that's what we figure out next. She nodded. A small nod, precise the same way everything she did was precise. There's something else, she said. Her tone shifted not much, but he was beginning to read the small gradations of it. This was the tone she used when she was moving toward something she'd been working up to. I haven't told you everything. He looked at her steadily. I know. That surprised her. The surprise was brief but real, the first purely unguarded expression he'd seen from her. You know, you've been careful about what you've shown me, organized. You're building trust in sequence before you hand me the full thing. He kept his voice even. I've been watching how you work. That's what you're doing. A long pause. She looked at him with that recalibrating attention again, the expression she got when she was revising something. Your brother's fortune, she said slowly, was not just being undermined by fraud. What does that mean? It means... She stopped, started again. There are documents I found in the back of the bottom drawer of that filing cabinet, behind a false panel. Daniel built it himself. You can see the tool marks are his. He hid them there, and I think he hid them because he was afraid of what would happen if the wrong people found them before the right ones did." Ethan went very still. "What's in them?" She opened the desk drawer and placed a folded leather portfolio on the desk between them. She didn't open it. She just set it there and put her hand flat on top of it. "Your brother knew what was happening to him," she said. "Not everything, but more than I thought. He was collecting evidence of his own. He just ran out of time before he could do anything with it." Her voice stayed level, but something in it was careful now, moving gently around something breakable. "And what he collected, Ethan, it changes the picture. It isn't just fraud. It isn't just manipulated contracts." He looked at the portfolio, then at her. "Show me," he said. She lifted her hand and opened it. The portfolio contained 11 documents. Ethan counted them without meaning to, the way a man counts exits in an unfamiliar room automatically before he knows why. Some were letters. Some were copied contract pages with annotations in Daniel's handwriting, cramped and urgent. Nothing like the easy looping script of the Christmas letters Ethan had been receiving for years. Some were receipts, and at the bottom, folded twice and worn soft at the creases from being handled many times, was a single page that wasn't any of those things. It was a list of names. 7 names written in Daniel's hand with dates beside each one, and short notes that were clipped and careful, the kind of notes a man writes when he's afraid someone else might read them. Ethan didn't recognize most of the names, but 2 of them he did. Pruitt, the attorney, and a name he'd heard only once that afternoon from a polished man with cold eyes and a friendly tone who'd ridden away without hurrying. Calder. Ethan set the page down on the desk very deliberately. "He knew," Ethan said. "He knew some of it." Eliza's voice was quiet. "The letters tell most of the story. He started writing them about 8 months before he died. I don't think he meant them as letters exactly. More like a record, something he could hand to someone if the time came." She paused. "I think he was writing them to you." Ethan looked up at her. "The last 3 are addressed to Ethan," she said. "He never sent them." The room was completely silent. Outside, the wind had come up. He could hear it moving through the grass, through the eaves, that low, steady sound that Montana made at night like it was breathing. "Give me a minute," he said. She stood up without a word and left the room. He sat there alone with the letters. He didn't read them all that night. He read the last one. The one dated 11 days before Daniel died, in handwriting that was shakier than the others, the letters pressing harder into the paper as though the pen hand had been unsteady and he'd compensated with pressure. "Ethan, if this finds you after I'm gone, then I ran out of time to do this right. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for more than that, but I'll start there. What I built here is real. The land is real. The cattle are real. The work of 12 years is real. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. But the money the fortune people talked about when they talked about Callaway Ranch, that was always closer to credit than cash, and there are men who understood that better than I did and used it against me. Pruitt knows. He's been their man from the start. I didn't see it until the 2nd year, and by then I'd signed enough documents through him that confronting him openly would have cost me more than staying quiet. Calder works for a man named Hale. Victor Hale. He doesn't come to Blackstone Ridge. He doesn't need to. He sends people, and he files documents, and he waits. He's been waiting a long time. I have the evidence in the portfolio. Eliza has been helping me without knowing how much she was helping. She's the most honest person on this ranch, and possibly the most capable person I've ever employed. If she's still there when you read this, listen to her. If she's gone, find her. Don't sell. Don't let them push you into selling. The land is worth more than any number they'll offer, and they know it. That's the whole point. I'm sorry I didn't write sooner. I'm sorry I didn't call you north when I should have. I thought I had more time. Your brother Daniel." Ethan folded the letter and sat with it in his hands for a long time. He was not a man who cried easily. He'd learned that young in a way that doesn't leave you. But something in his chest was doing something that had no other name, and he let it alone in the dark study with his brother's words in his hands until it passed enough that he could breathe around it. Then he stood up, put the letter back in the portfolio, and went to find Eliza. She was in the kitchen, not doing anything, sitting at the table with a cup of tea she hadn't touched, waiting. She looked up when he came in. "Victor Hale," he said. She held his gaze. "Yes." "Daniel named him. You already knew." "I found the name in the correspondence 2 months ago. I've been trying to learn everything I can about him before I knew whether to tell you." He sat down across from her. "Tell me now." She wrapped both hands around the teacup. "Victor Hale operates out of Billings. He's wealthy, genuinely wealthy, not the leveraged kind Daniel was. He acquires land primarily through legal mechanisms that look clean until you understand the structure underneath. He's done it in 3 other territories that I know of. I found references to 2 similar situations in Wyoming and 1 in Dakota Territory." She paused. "He doesn't break laws directly. He engineers circumstances that make other people break them for him, or that make law work in his direction. By the time a judge looks at any individual document, it looks legitimate. But if you look at all of it together, it's a different picture. That's what Daniel was trying to build. A complete picture, not just pieces." She looked at the portfolio he'd set on the table. "He got close. He didn't finish." "We'll finish it." She looked at him for a moment. "It won't be easy." "I didn't come to Montana for easy." Something moved across her face. Not quite a smile, but the closest thing to one he'd seen from her. It was brief, and then it was gone, and she was back to steady. "There are 3 pieces missing from what Daniel collected," she said. "The connection between Pruitt and Hale's operation. Daniel suspected it, but didn't have paper on it. The identity of whoever altered the invoices inside the ranch. It wasn't just outside suppliers adjusting figures. Someone with access to these books was making changes too. And the original source document for the Western Territorial Development Group, the Articles of Incorporation, or whatever Hale used to set it up, which would show his direct ownership. Can we get those things? The Pruitt connection, possibly. There's a land recording office in Helena that would have filings I haven't been able to access from here. The invoice alteration, I have a theory about that." She paused. "And the development group documentation is filed somewhere. Corporate records don't disappear, they just get buried. You need to go to Helena. We need someone to go to Helena. I can't leave the books unattended. If I'm gone more than a day or 2, the accounts become vulnerable again." She looked at him. "Briggs can manage the operations, but the financial records need eyes on them constantly right now." "Then I go to Helena." "You don't know what you're looking for." "Then write me a list." She was quiet for a moment. "It's not that simple. The filings I need are in the Territorial Land Records Office, and accessing them requires knowing exactly which sections to request, and the clerks there have relationships with certain interests that make them selective about what they find. You're saying someone might warn Hale's people if I start asking questions. I'm saying it's possible." She set the teacup down. "I need to think about how to do this without triggering them before we're ready. How long do we have before that promissory note on the South Pasture comes due? 57 days. And if it defaults, they invoke the access clause, which activates the boundary contract provisions, which gives Calder's clients the legal standing to begin proceedings on the eastern boundary." She said it steadily, but the weight of the timeline was in every word. "After that, it becomes a court matter, and courts move slowly, and Hale's people have more resources for a long court fight than we do." Ethan looked at the table. "So we have 57 days to build a case strong enough that the note default doesn't matter because the contracts behind it are fraudulent. Or to pay the note, which requires money we don't currently have." He thought about that. "How short are we?" "For the note alone, about $600 short of what we'd need. The operational accounts have been drained by the inflated invoices over 2 years. We've corrected the ongoing overcharges, but the money that was already taken isn't coming back quickly. What if we sold some cattle? 30 head at current market would cover it. But then we're undercapitalized going into winter, and if anything goes wrong..." She stopped herself, recalculated. "It's a risk, a manageable one maybe, but it leaves us with no margin." "What's the alternative?" Finding the evidence fast enough to file a legal challenge to the contracts before the note comes due. If we can get a judge to put the contracts under review, the note default loses its mechanism. Who's the judge in this territory? For land matters, a circuit judge named Alderman. He comes through Blackstone Ridge on his circuit every 6 weeks. She paused. He's due in 32 days. Ethan felt the shape of it sharpen. 32 days to get what we need. 32 days. He looked at her across the table. In the lamplight, she looked tired, genuinely. Tired not just tonight, but accumulated, the kind of tired that builds up over months of carrying something heavy alone. She hadn't complained once. He doubted she would. "You've been running this alone for 3 months," he said. "I've been running the accounts. Walt ran the ranch. You've been running all of it and you know it." She didn't argue the point. "I'm here now," he said. "Yes?" She picked up the teacup. "You are." The next morning brought the second threat. Not Calder this time. 2 men Ethan didn't know riding in before breakfast with hard faces and the kind of posture that was meant to communicate something without saying it directly. They asked for the ranch owner. When Ethan said that was him, they exchanged a look. "We represent the Harmon Supply Company," the taller one said. "There's a matter of the 30-day renewal on your feed contract that comes due end of this month. The new pricing terms have been set." "What terms?" The man handed him a folded paper. Ethan read it. The pricing had increased by 60% over the previous contract rate. "That's not a price adjustment," Ethan said. "That's extortion. It's within the terms of the renewal clause, Mr. Calloway. The renewal clause is under legal review." The man's expression didn't change. "That may be, but until a court says otherwise, the contract stands. If Calloway Ranch wants to receive feed deliveries this month, payment will be at the new rate." "Get off my land," Ethan said. The man blinked. He'd expected argument or negotiation, not that. "Mr. Calloway, you delivered a paper. I received it. That transaction is complete. Get off my land." A pause. The 2 men looked at each other again. Then they rode out. Eliza was at his shoulder the moment they cleared the gate. "They'll report back to Calder by tonight." "Good. I want them to know we're not flinching." Not flinching and having a plan are 2 different things. "We have 32 days to build a plan. In the meantime, we don't give them anything that looks like surrender." He turned back to the house. "Can we source feed elsewhere? Different supplier?" "There's a man named Corbett in the next county. He supplied Daniel 2 years ago before Fowler switched the account to Harmon." She followed him inside. "He's honest. Prices are fair. The only issue is the transport distance. It adds cost." "How much?" $10 to $15 per delivery. Less than 60% over market rate. Considerably less. "Contact Corbett today. Already writing the letter." She sat down and picked up her pen. "But Ethan, the Harmon contract, even if we replace them as a supplier, they can still claim the renewal fee as a debt. If they take it to a local magistrate, before we can challenge the contract itself. Add it to the list for Judge Alderman." She looked up. "You want to bring everything to Alderman at once. Why not? If the contracts are fraudulent, and the invoices are falsified, and the promissory note is connected, why make separate arguments? Make one argument. The full picture." She was quiet, looking at him with that assessing expression. "That's what Daniel was trying to do," she said. "He just couldn't get all the pieces together in time. Then we get the pieces he missed." She turned back to the letter. She wrote 3 lines, stopped, and said without looking up, "You're smarter about this than you let on. I've been listening to you for 2 days. That shouldn't be enough to think the way you're thinking." "I grew up poor," he said simply. "Poor people learn fast that if you fight one thing at a time against someone with more resources, you lose. You have to bring everything at once, or nothing at all." She looked up. "Your brother grew up poor too." "Daniel grew up hopeful," Ethan said. "That's different. He wasn't bitter when he said it, just true. He believed people meant well. I always checked." The invoice alteration theory broke open on the 4th day. Eliza had been quiet all morning, The focused interior, quiet that meant she was working on something she wasn't ready to say out loud yet. Ethan had learned to recognize it and leave her to it. He was going through the land survey records with Briggs when she appeared in the doorway of the barn with a ledger under her arm and an expression that he was beginning to read as controlled urgency. "Come inside," she said. He came inside. She laid the ledger open on the desk and pointed to a column of figures. "These are the corrected invoice amounts. The real numbers, what was actually delivered, and what it should have cost." She flipped to the next page. "These are the amounts that were recorded in the books, the inflated versions. I've seen these. Look at the handwriting." He looked. The original entries were in a fluid, slightly forward-leaning script he'd come to associate with the methodical record-keeping that predated Fowler. The altered figures, the inflated ones, were in a different hand. Tighter, more vertical. "That's not Fowler's handwriting," Ethan said. "No." She pointed to a small notation in the margin of one entry, an initial almost too small to see. F.P. Fowler used those initials on his correction marks. Standard bookkeeping practice, you initial your edits. She looked at him. The altered figures aren't initialed. They were added by someone who wasn't following standard bookkeeping protocol. Someone who didn't know to initial their edits. Or someone who was being careful not to leave a direct mark. She turned to a third page. But they made a different mistake. The pen pressure. The altered figures are written with heavier pressure than the surrounding entries, someone pressing harder, possibly writing less naturally, writing something they were concentrating on rather than writing from habit. She looked up. This wasn't Fowler. Fowler was skilled enough to make his entries look natural. This was someone less practiced who was making changes after the fact and trying not to be caught. Ethan stared at the pages. "Calder was here twice while Daniel was sick." "Yes." "Did he come inside?" "Both times. The second time Daniel asked me to be present. The first time..." She stopped. "The first time I was out with the supply delivery. Daniel met him alone." "Was this study unlocked?" She was very still. "It's always unlocked. Daniel didn't believe in locking rooms inside his own house." "So Calder was alone in this house at least once with access to the study. But Calder he's a representative, a polished man. I don't think he does his own..." "He brought someone with him," Ethan said. "Both times. A younger man who waited outside. Do you remember him?" Slowly, she nodded. "I only saw him the second time. He stayed with the horses." "Stayed with the horses," Ethan said, while Calder kept Daniel occupied in another room. The silence between them was sharp. "Someone was in here," she said, going through the books while Calder kept Daniel talking, and making changes that would look like accumulated errors if no one looked too carefully. He straightened. They weren't just manipulating from the outside. They had access to the books directly. That means they know how far Daniel got with his own evidence. She said it and then went pale, not dramatically, just a shade lighter, the color that comes when something cold moves through a person fast. "If they had access in here, they may know about the portfolio." "Did they find it?" "The false panel was intact when I found it. But..." She crossed to the filing cabinet and opened the bottom drawer, reached in and felt along the back panel. It opened smoothly. She checked the contents, counting quickly. "It's all here, all 11 documents." She exhaled slowly. They didn't find it. Or they found it and left it because taking it would signal that they'd been in here. She looked at him. "You think like a man who's been wronged before. I think like a man who grew up watching people take things from other people and smile while they did it." He took the portfolio from the drawer and set it on the desk. "We need to move this. Somewhere they can't reach if they decide to come back." "Where?" He thought about it. "Is there a bank in Blackstone Ridge?" "A small one." "Do you trust the banker?" He was Daniel's original banker before Fowler switched most of the accounts to a different institution. She paused. "I've wondered about that switch." Fowler switched Daniel away from a banker who might have noticed the irregularities, Ethan said. "That tells you something about the banker. It tells you he's either honest or he wasn't in on it." Same thing for our purposes. She picked up the portfolio, looked at it, then looked at him. You want to deposit this with a bank. I want to put it somewhere that if someone comes into this house and goes through every drawer and cabinet and false panel, they still don't get to Daniel's evidence. He met her eyes. Can you copy the key documents first? Keep one set here so we can work from them. She was already nodding. Not the hesitant nod of someone agreeing reluctantly, but the quick nod of someone whose mind had already moved to the next step. I can copy them today, tonight. I'll have them done by morning. Then we move the originals to the bank tomorrow. And we tell no one. Not even Briggs. She looked at him. For a moment, just a moment, something that wasn't quite vulnerability, but was in that neighborhood moved across her face. Then it was gone, and she was steady again. You've changed in 4 days, she said. I've learned in 4 days. It's more than that. She set the portfolio down and began organizing the copy materials. When you rode in, you were a man dealing with a death. Now you're a man dealing with a war. Daniel was dealing with a war. He just didn't have anyone to fight it with. Ethan sat down across from her. He does now. She paused in her work. Didn't look at him. He's gone, Ethan. The war isn't. Another pause longer. Then she picked up her pen and began copying the first document with the same precise hand she used for everything. And she didn't say anything else. But the quality of the silence between them had changed, become easier somehow. Less like the silence of two careful strangers, and more like the silence of two people who understood each other well enough not to fill the space unnecessarily. The twist arrived on the 6th morning, and it came from a direction neither of them had been watching. Pruitt came to the ranch. He arrived alone, which was unusual enough that Briggs sent a hand to find Ethan before letting him reach the house. Ethan met him at the gate. Pruitt looked worse than he had at their first meeting, thinner somehow in just a week. The nervous hands were worse. His eyes moved around the yard as if he were counting things that might be used against him. Mr. Calloway, he said, I need to speak with you privately. Say what you came to say. Pruitt looked at the ranch hand standing 20 feet behind Ethan. Please, privately. Ethan studied him for a moment. Then he sent the hand back to the barn and walked with Pruitt to the far side of the yard away from the house and the windows. Pruitt spoke very fast and very quietly. I know what you're doing. I know she's been pulling the records apart. And I know what Daniel put in that portfolio. I knew it existed. I just didn't know where he'd hidden it. He paused. I need you to know that I am not. I was not. I didn't know how far Hale intended to go. Ethan said nothing. He had learned from Eliza that silence pulled more out of a frightened man than questions did. I facilitated some of the documents. I won't insult you by pretending otherwise. Hale's people came to me 2 years ago with what they said was a straightforward land investment arrangement. Above board, they said. Legal, they said. His voice cracked slightly. By the time I understood what I was actually participating in, I was in it. They made sure of that. Why are you here? Pruitt swallowed. Because Calder was here last week, and he went back to Billings, and whatever he reported about you, Hale, has moved up his timeline. He's not waiting for the note default. He's sending someone to Blackstone Ridge, someone with authority to file directly with the Land Commissioner's office and push for immediate proceedings. His eyes were urgent. Within the week, possibly sooner. Ethan felt the timeline collapse. 32 days had just become something much shorter. Who's coming? Pruitt hesitated. A man named Garfield. He's Hale's legal operator. He files, he pressures, he moves quickly in territories where the legal framework is thin. He's done this before. Another pause, smaller. He's very good at it. Why tell me this? What do you want? I want out, Pruitt said. The simplicity of it, the desperation underneath the simplicity, was the most genuine thing he'd said. I want to give you what I have, and get out from under what I'm in. I have documentation. Not everything, but my portion of it, the filings I handled, the communication from Hale's office, the instructions I received. He met Ethan's eyes. It fills in pieces you don't have. Ethan looked at him for a long, assessing moment. If I take what you're offering, he said slowly, and I use it, and Hale's people find out, you turned, what happens to you? Pruitt looked at the ground. That's my concern. It becomes my concern if you're a witness I need standing upright in front of a judge. A pause. I've thought about that. Have you thought about what it means if I decide you're more useful to Hale as a warning than you are to me as an ally? Pruitt looked up sharply. I'm not threatening you, Ethan said. I'm asking you to be honest with me about your position because I need to know how much weight I can put on what you give me. He kept his voice level. If you're here because you're genuinely frightened and genuinely done, that's one thing. If you're here because Hale sent you to find out how much we have, that's another. The silence that followed was long enough to be its own answer. I'm frightened, Pruitt said finally. And I'm done. Both of those things are true. Ethan made a decision. Not a comfortable one. But he'd learned in the last 6 days that comfortable decisions were a luxury this situation didn't offer. Go home, he said. Don't go to your office. Don't contact anyone connected to Hale. In 3 hours, come back here with every document you have. We'll hear what you're offering. Pruitt exhaled a shaky, relieved sound. And Pruitt. The man stopped. Ethan's voice dropped quiet and absolute. If this is a play of some kind, if you come back and something you've told me turns out to be designed to send us in the wrong direction, I will make sure every judge in this territory knows every document you touched. I will make sure you have nowhere to practice and nothing to practice with. Am I clear? Pruitt looked at him. Completely, he said. He rode out. Ethan went straight to the house. Eliza was at the desk. She looked up and read his face immediately. What happened? We just ran out of time, he said. And we may have just gotten the piece we were missing. He pulled the chair out and sat. Let me tell you about Pruitt. Her pen was already down. She was already listening. Pruitt came back in 2 hours and 40 minutes, not 3 hours. The difference told Ethan something. The man had been ready, had probably had the documents packed before he ever rode out to the ranch that morning, which meant this wasn't impulse. He'd been thinking about this for a while and had finally gotten scared enough to move. He came inside without being asked and sat at the study table without waiting to be invited. His hands were steadier than they'd been at the gate. People calmed down once a decision was made, Ethan had noticed. The terror lived in the space before the choice. After it, there was just the work. He set a leather satchel on the table. Eliza opened it. She went through the contents without speaking for a long time. Her face was unreadable in the way it got when she was reading fast and processing faster, her eyes moving down each page with the focused quiet of someone who already knew the architecture of the fraud and was now finding where these new pieces fit. Ethan watched her instead of the documents. He'd learned that was the more useful thing to watch. After 10 minutes, she set the last page down and folded her hands on top of the stack. How did you receive these instructions? She asked Pruitt. Directly from Hale. From Garfield mostly. In writing, Hale's people always put things in writing because they believe their documents are airtight. A short, unhappy breath. Usually they are. Not this time. No, not this time. She tapped the top page. This letter authorizes you to file the land use amendments on Hale's behalf. It names Hale as principal. That's direct ownership connection, the thing we couldn't establish from the development group filings. She looked at Ethan. This is the missing piece. The third thing on your list. Yes. Ethan looked at Pruitt. When is Garfield arriving? I don't know exactly. Within the week is what I was told. He travels by rail to Billings and then overland. Depending on when he left, Pruitt stopped. Recalculated. He may already be in the territory. Can he file without you? He can file through the land commissioner's office directly. He doesn't need me for that. He needed me to prepare the documentation, which I did. Pruitt looked at the table. I submitted the prepared filings to him 3 weeks ago, before I decided. Eliza's voice was sharp for the first time. You already submitted the filings? Yes. Which filings? The contract enforcement claim on the eastern boundary. That and the note acceleration request on the south pasture. The room went very quiet. The 57-day timeline, Ethan said. Was 57 days from when I submitted those, Pruitt said. But Garfield has the authority to push the commissioner to expedite. If he files for emergency proceedings, how long does expedited take? Pruitt looked genuinely miserable. A week, maybe 10 days. Eliza stood up. She walked to the window and stood there with her back to both of them. Ethan could see the tension in her shoulders, not panic, never panic, but the acute concentration of someone rapidly recalculating every variable at once. "Judge Alderman," she said without turning around. 26 days? Ethan said. Too long. Can we request an emergency hearing before his scheduled circuit? She turned around. We'd need grounds. Documented filed grounds that demonstrate imminent irreparable harm to the estate. She looked at Pruitt. If you testify formally in writing sworn statement about the fraudulent nature of those filings, that gives us the grounds, Ethan said. That gives us an argument for emergency grounds. There's a difference. But she was already moving back to the desk, already pulling paper. It's the best argument we have. Pruitt's voice was careful. If I give a sworn statement, Hale will know within hours. His people are in this town. I don't know who, but they are. We know about Calder, Ethan said. Calder is one. There are others. People Hale pays to keep ears open in places like Blackstone Ridge. Pruitt's eyes moved. I don't know who they are. I was never told. Hale compartmentalizes. So when you sign a statement, we have to assume Garfield knows about it before the ink is dry, Ethan said. Yes. Ethan looked at Eliza. She was looking back at him. Then we don't give them time to react, he said. We file everything at once. Pruitt's statement. Daniel's evidence, the invoice fraud documentation, the contract analysis, everything. One filing. Judge Alderman's emergency contact. Alderman's circuit office is in Helena. How fast can a rider get to Helena? Hard riding 30 hours, 35. Can you write the emergency petition today? She looked at the stack of documents at Pruitt's satchel, at the copied pages from Daniel's portfolio. She was doing the calculation. He couldn't do the legal weight of each piece, how they fit together, what a judge would need to see to grant emergency consideration. If I start now, she said, and work through the night, yes. Then start now. She was already sitting down. Pruitt stayed, not because Ethan asked him to, because Eliza did practically in the way she did everything practical. She needed him to authenticate certain documents to initial specific pages, confirming they were the originals he'd received, to answer questions when the legal language of his correspondence needed clarification. He sat in the corner chair and answered when she asked, and stayed quiet when she didn't, and slowly over the course of the afternoon stopped looking like a man waiting for a blow and started looking like a man doing something useful. Ethan noticed that too. Briggs came in at dusk. He took in the situation, Pruitt in the corner, Eliza writing with the focused intensity of someone who'd forgotten the rest of the world, documents spread across every surface, and looked at Ethan. What do you need from me? I need your 2 best riders ready to leave for Helena before dawn. They'll carry a sealed packet and they don't stop except to rest the horses. Can you trust them to do that without asking questions? Hector and Mills, yes. Tell them tonight, quietly. Briggs nodded and left without another word. That was the thing about the man he didn't need. Things explained to him 3 times. He understood the shape of a situation from its outline and moved inside it without being managed. Ethan was grateful for that in a way he hadn't expected to be when he'd ridden onto this ranch 10 days ago, knowing nobody. 10 days. He'd known Eliza Hartley for 10 days. He sat down in the chair across from her and watched her write for a while. She'd been working for 6 hours without a real break, not counting the moments she stopped to question Pruitt, which weren't breaks so much as shifts in the type of work. Eat something, he said. In a while. Eliza. She looked up. He'd set a plate on the edge of the desk. Briggs had sent food from the cookhouse, same as every night. She looked at the plate. Then she picked up half a biscuit and ate it standing over the document she was drafting and kept writing. He almost smiled. Didn't, but almost. "How much of the petition is done?" he asked. "The foundation. The contract fraud section is drafted. I'm working on the invoice documentation now. I have to present it in a way that's clear to a judge who hasn't seen any of this before. The Pruitt statement still needs to be structured." She didn't stop writing. 3 more hours. Maybe 4. "I'll stay up with you." She looked up briefly, looked back down. "You don't need to." "I know." She didn't argue. That was also something he'd learned about her. She didn't argue about things that were already decided. Victor Hale's man arrived in Blackstone Ridge at 9 o'clock the following morning. Ethan knew it before he was told, because of the way word moved through a small town. Briggs heard it from the livery hand, who heard it from the general store owner, who'd watched a man check in at the hotel with 2 trunks and a manner that announced itself as important. Garfield. Had to be. The riders had left for Helena at 4 in the morning with the sealed petition and Pruitt's sworn statement and the copied documents and a letter from Ethan to Judge Alderman that was direct and clear and asked for exactly one thing, emergency consideration, before Garfield could file his claims with the land commissioner. Now it was a race. Eliza slept for 3 hours and came back to the desk looking like she hadn't. She'd been awake for something approaching 20 hours by Ethan's count, and she sat down and opened her remaining files with the same focused steadiness she'd had the first moment he'd seen her, which struck him as either remarkable or frightening, or possibly both. "Garfield will go to the commissioner's office first," she said. "Establish his presence, then he'll file. How long does the commissioner take to process a filing?" "For a standard claim, several days. For an expedited claim with the right pressure applied." She shook her head slightly. "1 day, maybe less. Our riders have 5 hours on him. In travel time, but the commissioner's office opens before the circuit court clerk. If Garfield files today, and we don't have a response in front of Alderman before the commissioner accepts the claim, then we're in defensive position. Yes, reacting instead of acting." She looked at him. "Hale's designed every step of this to put the estate in reactive position. It's what he does. Each move forces a response, and each response costs time and money until the estate either capitulates or runs out of both. He hasn't accounted for the petition. He hasn't accounted for Pruitt either." She was quiet for a moment. "Where is Pruitt?" "Guest room. Briggs is keeping an eye on him, not a guard, just present." Ethan paused. "He stayed." "I know." She looked at the desk. "He's more frightened of Hale than he is of us. That's why he came. But frightened men make unstable witnesses." He signed the statement. "He signed it last night when I was sitting across from him, and the alternative felt worse. When Garfield is in this town, and Hale's name is being said in rooms Pruitt can hear, that calculation may shift. What do we do if it does? The statement is signed and witnessed. His repudiation of it after the fact is its own kind of evidence." She folded her hands. "But it's weaker without him present and willing to speak." She looked up at Ethan. "We need Pruitt to hold." "Then I'll talk to him." "It's not a conversation, Ethan. It's not something you can argue him into. He either has the backbone for it or he doesn't. People have more backbone than they know when someone stands next to them." He stood up. "That's something I can do." She watched him go. And for just a moment, she wouldn't have allowed herself if she'd thought anyone was watching something moved across her face that was neither analysis nor strategy. Something quieter and more personal than either of those things. Then she turned back to the documents. Garfield came to the ranch that afternoon. Ethan had been half expecting it. Men like Garfield didn't file papers and wait. They filed papers and applied pressure simultaneously kept the target off balance, gave them no stable ground to stand on. It was a technique, a practiced one. He was younger than Ethan expected. Mid-30s, clean-shaven, with the kind of composed confidence that came from winning often. He carried a leather briefcase and wore a coat that hadn't seen trail dust, which meant he'd changed after arriving, which meant he was making an impression deliberately. He introduced himself on the porch with a handshake and a pleasant voice. "Mr. Calloway, I represent certain interests with existing legal agreements connected to this estate. I wanted to introduce myself personally before the formal proceedings begin." "That's considerate," Ethan said. "We prefer clarity to conflict. My clients have invested significantly in arrangements with this estate, and they'd like to see them honored. I think once you understand the full scope of the legal position—" "I understand it," Ethan said. A small pause. "I see. Well, then you'll understand that my clients have been very patient and very reasonable, and they'd still prefer a negotiated resolution to a drawn-out—" "What are you offering?" Garfield blinked. He'd been building to the offer, and having it demanded before the setup was complete disrupted the rhythm he'd prepared. "My clients are prepared to purchase the ranch outright at a fair market. Your client's idea of fair market is about 40 cents on the dollar based on what they offered my brother," Ethan said. "So let's not use that phrase." The pleasant composure didn't crack, but something behind it recalibrated. "Mr. Calloway, the legal proceedings that are about to begin will be costly, protracted, and given the state of the estate's finances. The estate's finances are not what they were 2 weeks ago. The debts are real, regardless of how the books are kept. Some of the debts are real, the ones that were created honestly." Ethan held the man's gaze. "The others are going to be a matter of considerable legal discussion." A beat. Then, "You've retained counsel. I've filed with Judge Alderman's circuit." It was the first time Garfield's composure showed anything underneath it. Not panic, he was too controlled for panic, but a rapid, invisible recalculation. He hadn't expected that. Hadn't expected it to happen that fast. On what grounds? The pleasant tone was still there, but thinner now, like ice that looks solid until you test it. "Fraud, contract manipulation, falsification of financial records, conspiracy to defraud an estate." Ethan said each one evenly the way Eliza had said things when she wanted the weight to land cleanly. "And we have testimony supporting all of it." Garfield was quiet for 3 full seconds. In a man like him, that was a long time. "I see," he said finally. "I'd say I hope this can be resolved fairly, but I think we both know what fairly looks like and what it doesn't." Ethan stepped back toward the door. "You have a long ride back to Billings, Mr. Garfield. Safe travels." He went inside. Eliza was standing just inside the door. She'd heard every word. "Testimony," she said quietly. "You told him we have testimony." "We do." "If he goes to Pruitt—" "He was going to go to Pruitt regardless. Now he goes knowing we've already used what Pruitt gave us." He looked at her. "Which means Pruitt is less valuable to threaten and more valuable to leave alone." She looked at him for a moment. "You thought that through." "While I was walking to the door." She was quiet. Then, that was well done. Coming from her, it landed differently than praise from other people. He noticed that, filed it away in the part of himself that was paying attention to things he hadn't expected to be paying attention to. "Pruitt," he said. "I need to tell him what just happened." "I'll come with you." No. Pruitt heard the account of Garfield's visit, with the expression of a man watching a flood move toward him and understanding for the first time that the levee he's standing on might hold. "He came here first," Pruitt said. "Before the commissioner." "Yes." "That means he's rattled. Garfield doesn't make personal visits when he's confident. He files and lets the process do the work." Pruitt's hands were flat on his knees. "If he's making personal visits, your filing scared him." "Good," Eliza said. "Let it scare him." "You don't understand what Hale will do when Garfield reports back." Pruitt looked at her directly. "He will escalate. He always escalates when something surprises him. He doesn't accept that things don't go according to his plan." "What does escalating look like?" Ethan asked. Pruitt hesitated. "Pruitt." Ethan's voice was quiet and final. "We are past the point where withholding information helps you. Whatever Hale does next, we need to see it coming. What does escalating look like?" A long breath. He has relationships with men who solve problems outside of legal channels. He doesn't direct them, he's too careful for that. But they become available when certain situations develop. The room was very still. He'd send someone to intimidate, Eliza said. Or worse, Pruitt said. I don't know for certain. I've never seen it happen directly. But there have been situations in Wyoming and the Dakota matter where people who were positioned to testify against his interests became unavailable. He looked at the table. I don't know what that means exactly, but it meant they didn't testify. Ethan looked at Eliza. She was already looking at him, and what was in her eyes was not fear, he knew by now. That fear didn't live there easily, but clear, serious calculation. She was thinking about what they were in and what it would ask of both of them. You should leave the ranch, he said to her. Stay in town somewhere with people around. No. Flat. No deliberation. No pause. Eliza, I am not leaving these records unattended. I am not leaving this case half-assembled because someone might come and frighten us. Her voice was level, and it was iron. If I leave, they've already won half of what they want. A panicked estate, records abandoned, no one holding the thread together. She met his eyes. I'm not leaving. I'm not asking you to abandon the case. I'm asking you to be somewhere safe while... The case is not separate from me. I built it. I know where every piece is and what it connects to and what it means. If something happens to me, yes, the documents exist, but the argument exists in my head. She said it without arrogance. Just true. You need me here. He wanted to argue. He had arguments ready. He didn't use them because she was right, and he knew she was right. And arguing against something true wasn't something he was willing to do just to feel like he'd said the protective thing. Then we don't leave each other alone, he said. Not on this property. Not until Alderman responds. She looked at him. The quality of that look was different from the assessing look she'd given him in the early days, less evaluation, more something else that didn't have as clean a name. Agreed, she said. Pruitt was watching them both. His expression had changed something in it that was almost wonder, or maybe just the recognition of two people who had stopped pretending the situation was anything other than what it was. You're going to win this, he said quietly. Not a prediction, more like something he was telling himself. We're going to try, Ethan said. Etched. The message from Alderman's circuit office arrived on the third morning after the riders had left for Helena. It came back with Hector, who had ridden the return leg in 28 hours on a fresh horse, and who arrived at the ranch gate looking like a man who had done an extraordinary thing, and knew it. Ethan opened the sealed response on the porch. He read it twice. Then he looked up. Eliza was standing in the doorway. She watched his face. Emergency hearing, he said. 9 days. She closed her eyes for 1 second. Just one. Then she opened them, and she was already thinking forward. 9 days, she said. We need to be ready to present everything. Can you have it organized by then? I've been organizing it for 3 months. She paused. But I need to prepare to speak, to stand in front of a judge and walk him through it. That's different from having it on paper. I know. I've never... She stopped, started again. I've never presented in a formal proceeding. You've been presenting to me for 10 days. You're the clearest thinker I've ever sat across a desk from. He held her gaze. You'll be fine. Something in her face softened, barely, almost nothing, but it was there, and it was real. Garfield will file his claims before the 9 days are up, she said. Let him. We'll have the emergency petition in front of Alderman before anything the commissioner accepts can move forward. Hale's people will know about the hearing. They'll prepare. So will we. She nodded slowly. Then we have 9 days. 9 days, he agreed. He was still holding the letter. She was still in the doorway. The distance between them, a few feet of Montana morning, felt smaller than it had 10 days ago. Not because either of them had moved exactly, but because what had been between them then was wariness and assessment and careful distance, and what was between them now was something that had been built from 10 days of working alongside each other in a crisis that required everything both of them had. It wasn't named yet. It didn't need to be. But it was there, solid and real as the documents in the filing cabinet, as real as the land outside that had been Daniel's dream, and was now Ethan's responsibility, and had become, without either of them planning it, something they were fighting for together. "We should get to work," she said. "Yes," he said. Neither of them moved for just a moment longer. Then she turned back inside, and he followed, and they sat down at the desk they'd been sharing for 10 days, and they got to work. The 9 days were the longest of Ethan's life, and the shortest Eliza had ever worked inside. They didn't stop. Not really. They slept in shifts when they had to, and ate when Briggs put food in front of them, and kept building the case, the way you build a fence in hard ground, post by post, no shortcuts, no gaps. Because one gap is all it takes for everything to get through. Pruitt stayed. That surprised Ethan more than almost anything else in those 9 days. He'd half expected the man to disappear in the night ride out quietly before the consequences of his decision fully arrived. But each morning, Pruitt was still there, pale and tightly wound, and more useful than Ethan had initially credited him for being. He knew the legal architecture of what Hale had built better than anyone, and Eliza used that knowledge the way a surgeon uses a map, precisely, purposefully cutting to exactly what she needed. On the 4th day, Garfield filed with the land commissioner. Briggs heard it through the same chain of quiet information that had told them Garfield was in town. The filing was for expedited proceedings on both the South Pasture Note and the Eastern Boundary Contract. The commissioner had accepted it. The clock was now running on 2 tracks simultaneously, Hale's process moving forward, Alderman's emergency hearing 5 days away. Eliza received the news, said nothing for about 30 seconds, and then asked Pruitt 3 specific questions about the commissioner's expedited process that Ethan didn't fully follow, but that seemed to settle something in her thinking. She wrote for another 2 hours and then looked up. "We're ready," she said. "Whatever they file between now and the hearing, we're ready." "You're sure?" "I'm sure of what we have. I'm not sure how Alderman reads it." She looked at him directly. "That's the variable we can't control. A judge is a human being, and human beings have blind spots in relationships and histories we don't know about. We've built the strongest case the evidence allows. What he does with it?" She paused. That part isn't ours. It was the most vulnerable thing she'd said in 9 days. Not the words exactly, the acknowledgement underneath them that there were limits to what preparation could guarantee. "It's enough," Ethan said. "You don't know that." "No. But Daniel spent months trying to build what you've built in 9 days with better materials. If it's not enough, it's not for lack of trying." He held her gaze. "And I don't think Daniel would bet against you." She was quiet for a moment. Something moved in her eyes, private, contained the way grief moved in people who didn't allow themselves much of it. "No," she said softly. "I don't suppose he would." The night before the hearing, Garfield came to the ranch a second time. It was after dark, which was different from the first visit. The first visit had been daylight performance, a man making a professional impression. This was something else. He came alone, which was also different. He asked to speak with Ethan privately. Eliza started to step back. "Stay," Ethan said. She stayed. Garfield looked at her, then at Ethan, and made some internal adjustment. "My clients have authorized a revised offer," he said, "given the changed circumstances." "What offer?" "Full payment of the outstanding debts, all of them including the disputed amounts, in exchange for a clear deed to the eastern boundary section and the south pasture." He paused. "The main house, the north pasture, and the bulk of the cattle operation remain with the estate. It's a genuine settlement, Mr. Calloway, not a buyout." Ethan looked at him. "What changed?" "I'm sorry. Last week you were talking about purchasing the ranch outright. Now you're offering to pay my debts and walk away with 2 sections. What changed?" Garfield's composure was impeccable. "My clients have reassessed. Your clients got a copy of our petition, and they don't want to be in front of Judge Alderman tomorrow." Ethan said it flat. "That's what changed." A pause. Very controlled. "The offer is genuine and time-limited. It expires at midnight. Tell your clients no. Mr. Calloway, the hearing tomorrow is not... Tell them no. Ethan's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Tell them we'll see them in court. Garfield looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Eliza, not the dismissive glance he'd given her that afternoon, not the professional assessment he'd worn before. This was something more considered. He was looking at her the way a man looks when he finally understands where the real danger has been sitting all along. "Miss Hartley," he said. His tone was almost respectful. "Mr. Garfield," she said. He left. When the sound of his horse was gone, Eliza set both hands flat on the desk and let out a breath that had clearly been held for some time. "They're scared," she said. "They should be. Scared men do unpredictable things. Scared men also make mistakes." He looked at her. "Get some sleep, a few hours at least." "You too." "I will." Neither of them moved immediately. The lamp was burning low. The house was quiet around them in the way it got late at night, when the ranch had gone still, that deep particular quiet of a working place at rest. "Ethan." She said his name the way she said things when she'd been deciding whether to say them. "Whatever happens tomorrow, you should know that this has been..." She stopped. "Started differently. When I came back to this ranch after Daniel died, I told myself it was about the work. About not letting them win. About what was right." She looked at the desk. That was true, but it wasn't all of it. He waited. "I stayed because I didn't have anywhere else that felt like this," she said. "And I've been honest about everything else, so I should be honest about that too." The lamp flickered slightly in a draft from somewhere. "I know," he said quietly. "I know that's why you stayed." She looked up. "I'm glad you did," he said. "I don't know what I would have ridden into without you here. I don't know if I would have understood fast enough or fought smart enough." He held her gaze. "I don't know a lot of things, but I know that." She didn't look away, and she didn't fill the silence with something practical, which from her was its own kind of answer. "Get some sleep," he said again. "Yes," she said. This time she meant it. The hearing was held in the largest room of the Blackstone Ridge Town Hall, which was not a large room. Judge Alderman was 60 years old and built like a man who had spent those 60 years not being impressed by things that wanted to impress him. He had gray eyes and a gray beard and the unhurried manner of someone who had heard a great many arguments and found most of them wanting. He sat at the front table with 3 folders already open and his glasses pushed up on his forehead, and he looked at the assembled parties, the way a man looks at a problem he has already begun solving. Garfield was there with a younger associate and a briefcase that probably contained a mirror image of everything they'd sent to Helena. The land commissioner's deputy sat to one side with his own files. Pruitt sat in the second row, pale and upright, dressed more carefully than Ethan had seen him dress all week. Ethan sat at one side of the presentation table. Eliza sat beside him. She had organized everything into a sequence that moved from the most concrete evidence, the original invoices against the altered records, through the contract analysis, through Daniel's collected evidence, and his letters, through Pruitt's sworn statement, and the documents establishing Hale's direct involvement, ending with the legal argument that tied all of it into a single coherent account of systematic fraud. She had rehearsed it. Not with notes. She didn't use notes when she presented. He'd discovered because she'd been carrying all of this in her head for so long it lived there as naturally as her own history. Alderman looked at both sides and said, "We'll hear the petitioning party first. Miss Hartley, I've read your filing. I have questions, but I'll let you present before I ask them. Proceed." She stood, and she began. She spoke for 40 minutes. Ethan had heard everything she said before, had been part of building every piece of it. But hearing it assembled and delivered in sequence in the plain, precise, emotionally grounded voice she used for things that mattered was different from living inside the work of it. It was like the difference between laying individual stones and standing back to see the wall. It was a wall. She walked Alderman through the invoice fraud with the original receipts and the altered records side by side. She walked him through the contract structure, explaining the clause mechanism that converted manufactured debt into land rights. She presented Daniel's evidence and read the relevant portions of his letters, not the personal ones, not the one addressed to Ethan, but the ones that documented what Daniel had observed and when he'd observed it. When she got to Pruitt, she was careful. She presented his statement and his documentation without editorializing, without making it more than it was or less than it was, and she noted clearly that he was present and available to speak if the court wished to examine him directly. When she got to the Hale connection, the letter in Garfield's filings that named Hale as principal, the corporate documentation that had taken her 3 months, and Daniel's hidden evidence and Pruitt's records all together to assemble, she set 3 documents on Alderman's table and let him read them. He read them twice. He took his glasses off his forehead and put them on his face to read them again. Then he looked at Garfield. "Mr. Garfield," he said, "respond." Garfield was good. Ethan had known he would be good, and he was right. He challenged the invoice evidence as misattributed. He characterized the contract clauses as standard industry practice. He argued that Daniel's letters were the private speculation of a man under financial stress, not legal evidence. He questioned Pruitt's credibility as a witness with obvious personal motivation to deflect blame. He was fluent and organized, and he never raised his voice. But he couldn't explain the letter. The letter naming Hale as principal in the land filings, the one from Garfield's own correspondence that Pruitt had provided, was in Garfield's handwriting. It had his signature. It named Victor Hale by name and identified the Western Territorial Development Group as Hale's vehicle. It predated the contracts by 3 months, which meant it predated the investment arrangements Garfield was now describing as good faith agreements. Alderman let Garfield finish. Then he picked up the letter. "Mr. Garfield, is this your signature?" A pause. "It appears to be." "Is it or isn't it?" "Yes, it is." "And this letter was written 3 months before the contracts in question were executed." "That's the date on the document, yes." "Which means the principal you represent had prior knowledge of and direction over the contractual arrangements before the other party to those contracts signed them. Judge, the prior planning of an investment arrangement doesn't constitute—" "Mr. Garfield." Alderman's voice was not loud. It was very, very even. "I'm going to ask you to stop talking for a moment while I look at these documents." He looked at the documents for 7 minutes. No one in the room made a sound. Garfield's associate was writing something in a notepad. Pruitt was looking at his hands. Ethan was looking at Eliza. She was looking at Alderman. Her hands were folded on the table in front of her. They were completely still. Then Alderman set the documents down and looked up. "I'm going to speak plainly," he said, "because I find that saves time. I have before me evidence of systematic invoice falsification contract language designed to manufacture and exploit default conditions and documentation, establishing that the principal beneficiary of these arrangements directed them before they were executed, which contradicts the good faith investment argument entirely." He looked at Garfield. "The filings submitted to the Land Commissioner's office by your clients are hereby stayed pending full evidentiary review. The contract enforcement claims are suspended. The note acceleration request is suspended." He looked at the Commissioner's deputy. "I'll want the Commissioner's office to provide all filings related to Callaway Ranch within 5 days. Every document. Don't curate." The deputy nodded tightly. Alderman looked at Garfield again. "Your clients have exposure here, Mr. Garfield. Significant exposure. I'd suggest you communicate that clearly when you report back." He paused. "And I will be sending an inquiry to the Territorial Attorney's Office regarding Mr. Victor Hale's activities in this and potentially other territories. That process is entirely separate from this estate matter and will proceed regardless of any settlement." He closed his folders. "Mr. Callaway," he said, looking at Ethan, "your brother's estate is under court protection effective immediately. The land is secure. The claims against it are stayed." He paused. "I'm sorry for your loss. Your brother appears to have been a man who deserved better than what he got." Ethan's throat tightened. He managed, "Thank you, Your Honor." Alderman nodded and stood, and that was the end of it. The room came apart in pieces. Garfield gathered his papers without speaking, and left with his associate in the efficient, contained manner of a man who was already thinking about the next stage of a problem. The commissioner's deputy spoke briefly with Alderman's clerk. Pruitt sat for a moment without moving, and then he let out a breath that seemed to empty him of something he'd been holding for a very long time. Ethan stood. Eliza stood beside him. She was gathering the documents from the table with the same methodical precision she brought to everything, stacking them in their sequence, checking the order. Her hands were shaking slightly. Not much. Just at the edges. If he hadn't been standing close enough to see it, he wouldn't have known. He put his hand over hers on the stack of documents, just for a moment, just to stop the shaking. She went still. Then she took a breath, and her hands were steady again, and she looked up at him. And what was in her face, all of it? The exhaustion and the relief, and the thing that had been building for 19 days in the space between two people who'd been through something together that neither of them had gone through before, was more honest than anything she'd said out loud. "We did it," she said. "You did it," he said. "We." She said it quietly and firmly, the way she said things she meant without negotiation. He nodded. "We." Pruitt appeared at Ethan's elbow. He looked diminished and also somehow lighter, the particular lightness of a man who has put down something heavy and doesn't miss it yet. "What happens to me now?" he asked. "That's between you and Alderman's inquiry," Ethan said. "I won't speak against you. What you gave us mattered." He paused. "What you do next matters more." Pruitt nodded slowly. "I know." He looked at Eliza. "You built something that Daniel couldn't. I want you to know I understand the difference." She looked at him steadily. "Daniel built the foundation. I built on what he started." She picked up the last of the documents. "Don't forget that." Pruitt didn't answer. But he nodded, and then he left, and it was just the two of them standing in a room that smelled like old wood and lamp oil, in a town that was going about its morning outside the windows, ordinary and unchanged, while something that had taken 3 months to build and 19 days to finish had just resolved itself. They rode back to the ranch in the middle of the afternoon. Not fast. There was no urgency now, the first time in 19 days, that the clock wasn't running against them, and the absence of that pressure was so unfamiliar that for a while neither of them knew what to do with the quiet. Briggs met them at the gate. He read their faces before they said a word. "Done?" he asked. "Done," Ethan said. Briggs nodded once, with the deep satisfaction of a man who has waited a long time to hear a single word. Then he went back to whatever he'd been doing, and the ranch went on around them the way it always had. Inside the study looked the same ledgers, documents, the filing cabinet with its false back panel, the desk they'd shared for 19 days. Eliza set the hearing documents down in their proper place and stood looking at them for a moment. "I should start the correction filings," she said, "with the commissioner's office. The stayed claims will need to be formally responded to, and the estate records updated with the court's findings before Eliza." She stopped. "Sit down," he said. "For 5 minutes. Just sit." She looked at him. Then she pulled the chair out and sat. He sat across from her, his side of the desk, her side of the desk, the arrangement they'd found in the first days and never changed. "What happens now?" she asked. "With the ranch? With everything?" He looked at the desk for a moment. "The ranch is secure. The claims are stayed. We'll work through the correction filings and rebuild the supplier accounts and get through winter in reasonable shape." He paused. "Spring, the cattle operation should start returning real income instead of inflated loss." "That's the ranch," she said. He looked at her. "I know." The quiet between them was different from the quiet of the working days. Not the silence of two people focused on the same problem, but the silence of two people looking at each other without the problem between them for the first time. "You said you stayed because this place felt real," he said. "Yes." "Does it still?" She considered that the way she considered everything, not immediately, not impulsively, but with the full weight of her attention. "More than before," she said. "Which I didn't think was possible." He nodded slowly. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly. Not strategically, not practically. She held his gaze. All right. Do you want to leave? The answer came faster than he expected. Not impulsive, but certain. The kind of certainty that's been there for a while, waiting to be asked. No, she said. He felt something settle in his chest. Then don't. It's not that simple. Why not? She was quiet for a moment. Because staying as an employee is one thing. Because staying as... She stopped, found the right language. Because what this has become is something I didn't plan for, and I'm not entirely sure what to do with it. Neither am I, he said. But I've figured out harder things in the last 19 days. Something that was fully genuinely a smile moved across her face. Brief and real, and the most unguarded thing he'd seen from her. That's true, she said. I'm not asking you to figure it all out today, he said. I'm asking you not to pack a bag and leave because you think your job is finished. Because it isn't. He held her gaze. Or because you think I'd rather work through the correction filings alone. Because I wouldn't. She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light was coming through the window. Outside the ranch was quiet and working and real. I'll stay through the correction filings, she said. Good. And through the winter accounts. Good. And through... She stopped herself. The smile was still there at the corner of her mouth. We'll see. We'll see, he agreed. That evening, Ethan went out to the north fence line alone. He needed to walk the land, his land secured, now real, in a way that the legal abstractions of the last weeks had almost made him forget. He needed to feel the ground under his boots, and hear the cattle, and remember what all of it had been for. He stood at the fence line where the north pasture opened up and looked at the sky going dark in the west, the colors bleeding out across Montana, the way they did at that hour, the particular extravagance of an open country sunset that had nothing to prove and everything to show. He thought about Daniel. Not the Daniel of the last months, the frightened man with the shaking handwriting and the hidden portfolio and the debt he couldn't outrun. The Daniel before that, the one who had written Christmas letters every year, ending the same way. Come north when you're ready, little brother. There's room here for 2 Callaways. He'd come north, too late for Daniel to know it, but he'd come, and the land was still here. The cattle, the north pasture, the house with the solid porch, and the curtains in the windows, and the desk that 2 people had built something around without planning to. All of it still here. He stood there until the sky was fully dark and the stars came out too many to count the way Montana stars always were dense and cold and permanent. Then he walked back to the house. The lamp was burning in the study. Eliza was at the desk. She'd started the correction filings. He could see had probably started them the moment he went outside because that was who she was, and he'd stopped expecting her to be anything different. She looked up when he came in. How's the fence? She asked. Good. Needs a few new posts on the north corner. Nothing urgent. She nodded and looked back at the documents. He hung his coat and sat down and pulled the file she'd set on his side of the desk and opened it. What am I looking at? He asked. Commissioner's correction form. The top section is the estate identification. You'll recognize all of it. The bottom section needs your signature in 3 places. He read it, signed where she'd indicated, slid it back across. She took it without looking up. Initialed her witness mark in the corner, the small, precise initial she put on everything she authenticated, and set it in the completed stack. They worked for another hour, and then 2. And the lamp burned steady, and the house was quiet around them, and outside the Montana night was wide and cold and full of stars. At some point she made coffee without being asked, and set a cup on his side of the desk, and went back to her work, and he drank it and kept going, and it was ordinary, and it was not ordinary at all. This was what Daniel had meant Ethan thought. Not the fortune, not the 1,400 acres on paper, not the cattle count or the asset valuation. This, a working desk, a shared lamp, 2 people who trusted each other enough to sit in the same silence and build something from what the land offered. This was the inheritance. He'd ridden into Blackstone Ridge with nothing but a letter naming him heir to a debt and a death and a ranch on the edge of collapse. He'd found instead what his brother had always been trying to tell him was waiting room enough for two and someone worth sharing it with. Near midnight, Eliza set her pen down. "That's the first filing done," she said. 14 more. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow?" she agreed. She stood and gathered the completed documents and stacked them neatly, and looked at the room with the expression of someone deciding something without needing to announce the decision. "Ethan," she said. He looked up. "Thank you," she said, "for not letting me fight this alone, even when I didn't ask you not to." He held her gaze. "Thank you for still being here when I arrived, even when no one asked you to stay." She nodded once. Small, certain. She left the room. He sat alone for a moment in the quiet. His brother's desk under his hands. His brother's land outside the window. His brother's words living somewhere in the kept documents and in the part of him that would always carry them. "Come north when you're ready, little brother." He'd come north. He'd come ready. And what he'd found, the land, the fight, the woman at the desk who had held everything together with precision and will and a kind of bone-deep honesty that made him want to be equal to it, was more than inheritance. It was a life. And on the quiet plains of Blackstone Ridge, under a sky full of permanent stars, two people who had come to the same place by entirely different roads had found without planning it and without rushing it. Something neither of them had started looking for, and neither of them would ever let go.